This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Yves Engler. Today we're going to be talking about Canada's ties to neo-Nazism in Ukraine, Canada's role in the NATO proxy war. Today we're going to discuss this with author Peter McFarlane, who is the author of a just released book, Family Ties: How a Ukrainian Nazi and a Living Witness Link Canada to Ukraine Today. I have to admit, I have not read the book, but I have read Peter McFarlane's one of his previous books, Northern Shadows, Canadians in Central America, which in my opinion is one of the best books on Canadian foreign policy. It came out, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s. That's a very good book that people should look at. Thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy. Peter, can you give us a sort of brief synopsis of Family Ties?
Yeah, okay. I guess the best place to start is with the title. What the book is built around is a look at Ukraine and Canadian policy from the point of view of a family connection of two families, the Chomiak and the Freeland family. That's the grandfather of Chrystia Freeland, and a Jewish family of Anne Charney, who wrote a brilliant book about her family experience in 1970s called Dobrid. She spent the war very close to where the Chomiaks were from, in a barn hiding from the Ukrainian nationalists and the Nazis. And so we trace, the book is in three parts. The first part deals with the 1930s and 40s in Ukraine. The second part deals with the former Nazis and the SS people who came to Canada in the 1940s and established themselves in Canada, and as well as the Charney coming to Canada as well in the 1940s. And the third part is kind of a return, because in 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, many of the Ukrainian nationalists returned to Ukraine, and they had quite an influence on the development of Ukraine at that particular time. Chrystia Freeland's mother, for example, helped write the Constitution in Ukraine. She returned in 1991, and Chrystia Freeland shortly thereafter, and her uncle as well was. He still lives in Ukraine. So it's a story about the Ukrainians of the 40s coming to Canada and then returning to Ukraine, and sort of the social movements in between that brought them forward into Canada and then back again.
So before we're getting to the sort of war today, tell us a little bit about the Nazi former SS people who came to Canada after World War II, which is of course in the news recently with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress fundraising for a lawsuit to block the release of the names. I believe it's 900 names in the I think it's the Duchesne mid-1980s Duchesne report. Half of it was released, half of it is still secret. And also kind of somewhat tied to that, the recent news about maybe a week or so ago that came out that of the victims of the memorial of the victims of communism that's being set up in Ottawa, that 330 of the 550 names for that appear to actually have Nazi, they were former SS or ties to the Nazis, and so the monument's being kind of postponed because it's a bit of a public relations disaster in the aftermath of the Hunka affair, where Canada Parliament celebrated the former SS soldier. Can you just tell us a bit of that history and maybe bring it up a little bit into today?
Yeah, I think you really have to start around, I guess, around 1940 in that history, because that was when, prior to that, most of the Ukrainians in Canada were sort of left-wing. A lot of them were affiliated with the Communist Party. They were, and of course, they were a big problem for the Canadian government. They spent all their time trying to contain the Ukrainian leftists on the prairies, that sort of thing. And it was during the early part of the war that the government stepped in and took favored and funded the small right-wing Ukrainian groups that were established, I guess, around 1928 or something like that. And they seized the property, et cetera, of all the left-wing groups. That was in 1940, the Canadian government. And since then, the ideology of the official Ukrainians organizations have been far to the right. At the time, in 1940, most of them favored the Nazis and the fascists. They were told by the Canadian government that they had to drop their affiliation with the fascism, and if so, they would be funded and supported in Canada, which they were. And so that is how, when at the end of the war, there was this group of right-wing, well-funded Ukrainian Canadians who lobbied intensely to bring the SS men and collaborators like Michael Chomiak, bring them into Canada and open the doors for them. And the Canadian government was only too happy to accommodate that, because they were then seen as Cold War assets, right? The Cold War right after. So for from the 1940s right through to the 1980s, the Ukrainians in Canada were kind of leading cold warriors internationally. They controlled the international organizations and that sort of thing. And so that was right up to, I guess, at least to the 80s. With the Duchesne Commission in the 1980s, there was a movement to examine what kind of people that they let in, those SS men. What were they? Were they war criminals? That sort of thing. And the Duchesne Commission held a lot of public hearings, but they kept central documents secret. And those are the documents that they've never released, that would have given the names of the war criminals among the Ukrainians. And those are documents right now. The Ukrainian organizations are in court trying to keep secret, because they would reveal the extent of the sort of the pro-fascist Nazi activists within the Ukrainian community.
And so you touched on this a bit about the influence that sort of Ukrainian nationalists in Canada had kind of post-Soviet Union, and even throughout. I mean, we have like Radio Canada International, we had like right-wing Ukrainians pumping information into Ukraine, into the Soviet Union, to Ukraine during the Cold War. But then after Ukraine becomes an independent country, I think that picks up quite significantly, and you see lots of Canadians, setting up NGOs, and Canada funding NGOs, and a certain type of anti-Russian Ukrainian nationalism, I think, is really pushed aggressively by Ottawa. Can you give us like just a little bit more of that, and then maybe kind of bring that a bit into today and the war? Like, people talk about, I think it's 2019, when Zelensky's elected, he's elected on a peace ticket, but then he tries to begin negotiations, and far right forces, undercut the effort between Zelensky and Putin to come to some sort of conclusion to the war in the east of the country. But yeah, can you just sort of bring some of that history, Canada's role in that history, to up into the more current kind of phase?
Yeah, sure. Actually, Canada was very important. The Canadian diaspora of the Ukrainians was very important in bringing the sort of the ideology of Bandera, et cetera, back to Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine had been part of the Soviet Union. Most Ukrainians, even in Western Ukraine, it's sort of, or they no longer had any interest in the Bandera sort of ideology, that sort of fascist, nationalist, ethno-nationalist ideology. It wasn't strong at all. If you might read works by Ivan Kachanovsky. He grew up near in the Western Ukraine, and he said that at the time he heard nobody ever speak positively of Bandera. It was in some sectors it was a swear word. They had lost all credibility. It was the diaspora in sort of the hothouse, Cold War hothouse in Canada, that was and guys like Michael Chomiak were very influential in preserving that ideology. And it was who brought it back to a large extent, the diaspora, into Ukraine. So that starts in the early 1990s. As I mentioned, the family members, et cetera, and the Ukrainians that went back, they brought back the ideology. And of course, our governments with the anti-Russian and anti-Soviet past were only too happy to work with them and work with that ideology in Ukraine, and to promote that kind of ethnic nationalism that they promoted in Western Ukraine, and try to promote that throughout the country. I mean, the Cold War element, the new Cold War. There's kind of the joke in Ukraine today is that if you woke somebody up who'd been asleep since 2008 and said that Russia and Ukraine were at war, or Ukrainian, they would say, who are we at war with? That it was since 2008 that NATO has been working very hard to have that ethno-nationalist ideology throughout Ukraine that is super anti-Russia-phobic, et cetera. So that's part of the reality of Ukraine today. And it was a real force in the Maidan in 2014, which was the coup, I guess some say it's the coup, in 2014 when they overthrew the government of Yanukovych. There was mass demonstrations in 2014 that overthrew the democratic government. And a major force in that were the nationalists that we had sort of cultivated.
And the Canadian government, should be noted, played a fairly significant role in the ouster of Yanukovych with the C-14, and one of the far-right groups actually used the Canadian embassy, which was close to Maidan Square, for more than a week as a base of their anti-Yanukovych mobilization. And John Baird, early in the Maidan protests, went to Maidan Square and participated in the protest, and Canada tried to sort of destabilize Yanukovych's government kind of all the way through. And then after he's ousted, the Harper government really picks up aid, and Canadian officials are there, very much tries to sort of consolidate the illegitimate post Yanukovych government. So Canada plays an important role in that. And then that's what leads to Russia seizing Crimea, and then that's what leads to the war in the East, which is very important in of course the full-fledged Russian invasion of February 2022. But yeah, so I saw this story or this post on X today from this U.S. prof, and she says that the Azov battalion, which is one of these far-right, the most prominent far-right force in Ukraine, that they sort of like, the idea is they've changed. And what she says, in fact, yes, they have changed. What they have now is they don't just have a regiment. They have two different battalions in the military. They have way more weapons, because now the Americans changed their rules against allowing weapons to Azov. They had rules restricting it, and then they eliminated those. They have way more sort of standing, and basically they're much more influential, contrary to the framing, than they were 2.5 years ago. And I've seen reports saying that that's increasingly, the public opinion in Ukraine is increasingly saying, okay, we need to have some sort of negotiated solution to this horrible war. And I should state, personally, I think the Russian invasion is contrary to international law and should be opposed. But I think there is a whole context of NATO's role in provoking it and stuff like that. And fueling it and continuing it. And so, I guess, what do you see as the role of this sort of like far-right forces in Ukraine today in undercutting an end to this horrible war? And I guess maybe just more generally, the role of NATO and Canadian policy in stoking and provoking the war.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it really played an essential role right from the beginning. I think you might have mentioned that Zelensky was elected in 2019. He was elected on a peace plan by I think it was 73% of the population to do a peace deal with Russia, and he promised he would do a deal. He said he'd meet with the devil, anything to make sure they had peace with Russia. And within 3 or 4 months of his election, there were massive demonstrations organized by Azov, of the nationalist forces in the country. Massive would be, I'm talking millions, like 20,000 people, but 20,000 people who were well armed. And at the time, Azov already had its own battalion within the military. And the movement was called a no capitulation movement. And at the time, it was openly said that they would kill Zelensky if he ever dared to do a deal with Russia. It was very openly. They said they'd hang him on the main street of Kiev, and the death threats were again from Azov and the other organizations, similar right-wing organizations. And it was shortly after that. Also, you have to say that the allies, the Europeans and the Canadians and the Americans, were also very much against a deal with Putin. They were, for geopolitical reasons, they wanted to weaken Russia. That was already clear by 2019, and so they were there supporting the forces of no capitulation. As a matter of fact, CBC during that big demonstration in Kiev managed to find Bonham Chomiak's son, who was born in Canada, but is a big guy in the grain business in Ukraine now. He was in the demonstration as well and saying no capitulation. It was very clear that the right wing would not allow it. And their threats weren't empty threats to kill Zelensky. They had real power because they had military force.
And
that continues today, even today. And you're right, yeah.
So that would be that Chomiak would be, would the relation to Chrystia Freeland be?
Oh, his uncle, her uncle.
Her uncle, okay.
Sorry. Yeah, and he was he grew up in Canada, so in Edmonton, he was very much part of the family. And today it's the same thing. They have even more power now, as you mentioned. There's two now forces, and in Ukraine, what opinion polls they've been able to determine, it's like 50, 60, 70% in there. It changes, who want a peace deal with Russia, even if they have to give up some territory. And they wanted it in 2019, and they weren't allowed to get it. And now the forces of no capitulation are even stronger. So it's really hard to see, even if Zelensky came out today and said, I'll do a deal with Putin. Well, I think he'd be gone. He would be shot or imprisoned or something.
And we should state that, even Justin Trudeau is still, it's only about 2 weeks ago, Trudeau was taking a more hawkish position than Joe Biden, where he was publicly saying we should be allowing or enabling Ukraine to fire missiles 300 kilometers into Russia. There's the Storm Shadows, I believe, the British one, and there's the ATACMS. I don't know if that's pronounced properly, the American one, but different missiles that need NATO officers and NATO intelligence to be fired. So it wouldn't just be Ukraine firing them into Russia, but NATO would be directly involved in the process. And Trudeau came out sort of pushing that line, and fortunately, it seems like it's the Pentagon people got won over Joe Biden, and there's more people like Blinken, the more neoconservative element to the Biden administration, wanted to go in that direction, and Trudeau was pushing in that direction. But the more sober-minded Pentagon people seem to have kind of won that discussion, at least for now. So yeah, I guess maybe a little bit just on Canada's role, kind of more broadly, the Canadian government in fueling the NATO proxy war.
Yeah, I think without a doubt, after like Zelensky and the Azov battalion, the most hawkish people in the world are the Canadian government. And if you go to any European country, the elections show that 30-40% of the people vote for parties that are against supporting the war in Ukraine, and certainly in France and in Germany, and most of the recent elections in Europe. I mean, in Slovakia and Czechia, parties have been winning the popular vote as by opposing the war in Ukraine. And in Canada, there's not even it was not an accident that it was unanimous ovation to the SS man in the Canadian Parliament. It's unquestioned in Canada. The whole ethno-nationalist extremist view of the right wing in Ukraine is embedded in our politics here. And it's a kind of it's strange, actually, to the degree that there's no questioning at all. And even in the States, I mean, there's major questioning. Maybe half the population is against supporting the war in Ukraine. But in Canada, there's the great silence. All our elites are of one voice, that we must support this right to the bitter end. Even if the bitter end, I mean, it's quite possible the bitter end is a nuclear war when you're dealing with a war against Russia, the largest nuclear power in the world.
Well, let's hope that your book pierces a little bit of that one-sided view of what's going on in Ukraine in the Canadian media and political sphere. Thanks a lot for coming on to Talking Foreign Policy. The book, again, is Family Ties: How a Ukrainian Nazi and a Living Witness Linked Canada to Ukraine Today. Thanks a lot for coming on, Peter.
was a pleasure. Good to see you.